Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Christina Krishbaum. I'm the Program Manager for the Nonprofit Partnership. We're happy to welcome you today for our webinar, Meaningful Data, How to Collect Useful Data with Michelle Molina. Thank you so much, Michelle, for joining us today. TNP exists to build the capacity of nonprofit organizations, and we so appreciate your support throughout this time, and we appreciate supporting all of you. During this time, we do look to continue to provide these time-sensitive webinars, our HR check-ins, and we do have a couple upcoming events that I think might really be interesting for quite a lot of people, actually. So actually next week, we just announced these yesterday, and some of you may have received an email on this already, but we announced a series of workshops that we're holding next week. 4 of them, entitled Caring for Ourselves and Others. It's an interactive workshop designed to help everyone process all that's been happening with the pandemic and help themselves and also help their teams through this time. We're holding 4 sessions. One of them is exclusive for executive directors only, and that will be the Friday morning session. But other than that, we have it on June 23rd, June 25th, and June 26th in the afternoon. So take a look at our calendar, and if you'd like to sign up, they are limited to 25 people per session. So, and we do ask that you only sign up for 1 session so that we can spread the wealth as much as possible. Those sessions are free, so it's a great chance to open up some dialogue and hopefully get some great tips and resources for helping take care of ourselves during this time. In addition to that, TNP is, of course, running our regular programming. We do hope that you'll be joining us for some workshops. A particular excitement for us is our Giving USA Breakfast Series event, which will take place on June 30th. And Richard Tollefson with Phoenix Philanthropy will return again to share the results of the Giving USA study and also to share some insights into what he sees are going to be the trends post-COVID for fund development and fundraising in the United States. So it looks to be a really promising event. We will also be sharing out the infographic for everybody that attends with the Giving USA reports and data. So just as far as for the webinar itself, for today's webinar, want to let you know that we are recording it, and we will have both the recording and the slides available for you. They'll be posted up on TNP's website, as well as our social media on Facebook, LinkedIn, and our YouTube channel. And we will also email it directly to anybody that registered, so you don't have to worry about taking copious notes right now. We hope that you're able to listen and absorb some of this information and see what you can take back to your organization to make use. Other than that, if you would like to introduce yourself in the chat box, please feel free to do that. It's a great chance to network. As I said, we have over 70 people registered for this webinar today. So hopefully you get a chance to network with everybody and get to know each other. I know we have some people already introducing themselves in that chat box, so please use it for that purpose. If you have questions, please post them up in that Q&A box. We will make every effort to answer your questions during the session. If anything is a little bit more detailed, we'll follow up with Michelle afterwards and send you a follow-up response. I wanted to thank our sponsors for this webinar and actually put out a special shout out to some of our funders who've been able to come forward with additional funding to continue offering these programs for free during this time that are related to the pandemic. So the Josephine Escambar Foundation, the Munzer Foundation, as well as the Miller Foundation have all put forth some funding to help with these, and we are truly appreciative to them for doing that. And with that, I would like to introduce Michelle Molina, so who you're all here to see today. I've actually been really looking forward to this session for quite some time. We were trying to put this together last year, and it took a little bit more time than we wanted. But really a great timing to put this together now, since we're looking at collecting new data as related to COVID, and also what do we do with our existing data? Does it still make sense? How do we make best use of it? So Michelle has been working, she has her own company, Connecting Evidence, and she's been working with several nonprofits, both in Orange County and LA County, on working on how to really process that data and helping us come out with meaningful stories to tell with our data. She holds a master's in education, focusing on social research methodology from UCLA, and she has been a delight to work with so far. I'm really looking forward to this. So Michelle, the floor is yours. I will be in the background, video off and sound off, but I will be in the background being willing to help out with anything you need. Michelle?
All right, hi, good morning, everybody. Let's see if I could get my keyboard to work. Okay, so today's objectives are going to be to understand how to identify useful data, start the reflection process so that you can ensure you are identifying useful data for your organization. And along the way, I'm also going to give you information so that you understand the general data collection methods that are out there and hopefully increase your confidence in your ability to use data. So I want to stop for a second, but right at the beginning of our time together, and have you have a moment to reflect on what do you hope to get out of this webinar, and what do you hope or wish you can use your data for? So feel free to put that in the comments or just think about it. Okay. Let's see. So one of the big takeaways I hope that you get from this webinar is that data are a means to an end. And that end is to hopefully ultimately achieve your impact. So we should be collecting data that's useful to our organization that we can use as a tool to understand to what extent we are achieving our impact and hopefully progress along our journey more. In order for our data to really be meaningful, we need to be really thoughtful about what we are collecting and why we are collecting those data. And that's why it's important for us to reflect and consider how we might improve our data collection processes and how we use data along the way. Okay. So before we get into how to start collecting meaningful data, let's take a moment and think about what meaningful data are. Meaningful data are data that will help you make improvements, help you make decisions, help you understand if you are achieving your outcomes. That is, to what extent is your organization successful in achieving the changes you hope to see? And will also help you advocate for your work. So help you make a claim that there is a need in your community for your services and that your services are actually helpful in achieving your outcomes. So when we're thinking about what meaningful data are, we're thinking about data that will help us do all of these things. I was recently talking to a colleague of mine, Amanda from the Youth Volunteer Corps, and I asked her why she thinks data is important, and she shared with me that we owe it to the people we serve to be effective. A lot of times we have the best intentions and we come to the work we do with a lot of assumptions. Data really helps us make sure that one, our work is effective and that we are working towards our mission. And if we're not, it helps us figure out that we're not so that we can get back on the right track. So during this webinar, I'm going to share some activities you can do to reflect on the usefulness of your data and hopefully identify data that will be more useful to your organization. We're going to start by taking stock of what you are already doing, identify key outcomes, consider your decision-making processes, and consider your improvement-making process. All right, so let's start by taking stock. And I shared some handouts with you all. If you haven't received them yet, I'm sure you'll get them after this webinar, so you can use them on your own time to do this activity on your own. So make sure to check that out. When we're thinking about considering our context, one framework that I have found very useful is a framework outlined in the Water of Systems Change article that talks about the different levers of systems change that exist in the world. It's a great way for us to consider how our work fits into the system we live in. The 5 levers of systems change, or 5 conditions of systems change, are policy. So this is rules, regulations, laws, practices. You can think of these as organizational habits, resource flow, so where money is allocated and how it's allocated, relationships and connections, so who knows each other and are they working together, power dynamics. You can think of this as who has the power to make decisions and how are people interconnected there, and mental models. So how are our beliefs influencing our work? So you can consider these 5 factors when you think about your context. What you want to do is consider how these 5 levers, conditions influence your work. And throughout the webinar, I'm going to be sharing examples from Bright Beginnings. And Bright Beginnings is a collective impact initiative. They're working to transform systems to improve the lives of children and their families. And they're doing several various projects. So because it's a collective impact initiative, we have several community action teams that are each working on their own activities. So I'm going to share examples from this initiative and the various activities they're doing. So when we're thinking about the systems levers in this case, for example, there are laws that work in our favor, so our facilitators to the changes we want to see, and there's also laws or aspects of laws that are potential challenges or obstacles to us. So one of the things that Bright Beginnings really wants to do is encourage participation in early childhood education. So think of preschool, transitional kindergarten, and kindergarten. Some policies that work in our favor are the local control funding formula, which makes it so that school districts have to get parent feedback to consider how they're going to allocate funds. A policy that works against us is that early childhood education programs are not required by law, so sometimes people don't think they're necessary. In terms of practices, a couple examples here are, we have, like I said, several community action teams that meet together regularly to push forward activities and programs that should help us achieve early childhood participation in early childhood education. But there's also few staff members and key organizations that can point parents to the right way. So that's the practice that doesn't work in our favor. There's also a number of funders in the area or in the Monterey community that are interested in early childhood education. But in terms of funding, there are a lot of funds that are allocated to elementary schools that can't be used or are not usually used for preschool and transitional kindergarten. And you can think of connections that work in our favor also, and connections that are potential challenges. For example, we have our coalition members and our parent advocate groups. Those are connections that work in our favor. However, there are a number of partner organizations that are not active in these groups. There's also power dynamics that work in our favor and our potential challenges. For example, we have a number of school district leaders that are advocates, but there's also some policy members that, although they are interested in early childhood education, don't list it as one of their core action points or things they're going to campaign for. And in terms of mental models, a lot of our community members, like in any community, want the best for their children. But a mental model that works against us is that some community members feel like early childhood education or children are too young to go to start school. So what you want to do here is think of these levers when you're thinking about your context and consider what's working in your favor and what's not working in your favor. And then you want to consider what you're doing to address these five levers. So in Bright Beginnings, we have a Preschool for All campaign. We have school districts working to clarify communication and a resource fair. We have advocate groups going to meetings that are related to budgets. There are several community action teams, and we're trying to activate those that might not be as active and bring partners in. In terms of power dynamics, we have Mama's group, which is a mom's group. They're advocates working to increase early childhood education in the community. And there's also, in terms of mental models, we have maternal mental health awareness campaigns going on. So this is just some examples of the various activity we're doing across these 5 levers to hopefully see a change. So when you're considering your context, you also want to think about how the work you're doing might be influencing the system. So when you work on one particular lever, you might be changing or making it easier to move another lever. So for example, if we increase the number of people in our community that believe that early childhood education is something their kids should participate in. That means there's going to be more public support. And because of that, there's a greater likelihood that we're going to be able to have policy change in our community. So when you think about the systems your work lives in, be aware that these various components influence each other, and they can be facilitators or potential obstacles. Another thing you should do is to consider when you're reflecting on your work, whether or not you're leveraging opportunities. For example, as we all know, there's been a lot of protests out there, particularly about how budgets are allocated in cities. This is an opportunity for our community, for example, to advocate for funds to be used in early childhood education instead. So it's good to always go in and consider how these levers are influencing your work on a regular basis, because things might change and there might be more strategic opportunities that come up. And once you do all this, you also want to consider whether or not we're doing enough to see the changes we want to see. So all that was to really consider our context and the work we do in the system it lives in. Once you do that, it's time to switch over and start thinking about data. So I encourage you all to really list all the current data activities you're doing, so data collection activities you're doing. Then consider how you are using those data. Are you using those data to make decisions, make improvements, understand if you are achieving your outcomes? Are you using that data to advocate for your work? How are you really using it? And once you do that, you can start identifying potential opportunities. So again, all this is to reflect on your current work, think strategically about what you're doing and the data you're collecting, to hopefully ensure that you are collecting data that is really useful to your organization. So I'm going to provide an example, but as I do, I want you to really think about how often you reflect on the usefulness of the data you are collecting. So the example I'm going to provide is, again, from Bright Beginnings. So Bright Beginnings, as I said, has several community action teams, and one of the community action teams is the Greenfields Community Action Team, and it's made out of several district partners. And what they really want to do is increase enrollment in preschool, transitional kindergarten, and kindergarten. And they're really focusing on increasing enrollment in transitional kindergarten. Every year they have a resource fair, and the goal of this resource fair is to, one, make parents aware that they should enroll their child, and then also give them access to all the resources they are going to need to complete the application. So as you probably know, in order for a child to enroll into school, there's a number of things they have to do. And if a parent is not aware of this with enough time, they might not be able to complete the application, and therefore it might be harder for their child to start school. So during this resource fair, it's a very unique opportunity for us to potentially connect and collect data from community members we might not have interacted with before. So this is a group of parents that are, one, interested in early childhood education and might be interacting with us for the first time. So it's a very unique opportunity for us to get some feedback from them. So during the resource fair, we conduct a resource fair survey, and we encourage people to complete this by having a raffle. So if they complete the survey, they can enter into a raffle that's held at the fair. So previously, what we asked people was which booths they visited during the fair, whether or not they encountered a new resource, to what extent they learned something during the fair, and whether or not in their daily lives they practice some literacy building skills with their children. So because we love to reflect, I asked the team whether or not this data has actually been useful to them. So how are you using it? Is it beneficial to you? So when we did this, we really identified that we actually use this to understand how useful the fair is. So whether or not people gain something from it, and to understand whether or not people were tied into or connected with new resources. Given that this is a very unique opportunity for us to collect information from families, we asked ourselves whether or not there was something else we could collect, something that would be more beneficial for us as when we think about the work we want to do in the future. And during this discussion, we identified that one of the assumptions the team had was that a lot of families feel that a full day program would be too much for their young children, and that they would be more interested in a part-time program, something like a morning preschool versus a full day preschool. So we decided to use this opportunity to explore that assumption. So we asked in our new survey parents about their early childhood education preferences. And because of the reason this fair is organized is to give parents enough time to complete the requirements, we asked them whether or not they felt they had enough time to complete the requirements. So now what we're doing is asking people whether or not they learned something during the fair, if they identified any new resources, whether they had time to complete the requirements, and whether or not, what sort of programs they would be interested in, full-time, part-time. And what we actually found when we did a quick analysis of the data was that there are a lot of people who are actually interested in full-time programs. So our team is now going to be able to use this data to identify not only understand what the community wants, but also advocate for what sort of programs they want their school district to have. So as opposed to advocating for part-time programs like they were planning to do, they're more likely now to advocate for a full-time program. Okay, so I'll pause there, and I think we have a poll asking you all to consider how often you reflect on how useful the data you are collecting is. So how often do you reflect on the usefulness of your data?
We're seeing some of the answers come in. If you look on your screen, you should see a poll question. Please help us out by just clicking what your answer is on that and hit submit. We'll leave it up for just a few more seconds. We had about half of you respond. Okay, about 5 more seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, and sharing that out.
All right, so it sounds like, or it looks like most of you reflect on the usefulness of your data often or very often. So that's great. So I hope that this has given you another tool to use when you are reflecting on the usefulness of your data. So to consider your context, list your activities, describe how you're currently using your activities, and then consider new opportunities. So new opportunities to collect more useful data. Something that I found that a lot of organizations are hesitant about is stopping collecting some data collection. And what I would encourage you to do is that if you are not using a data source or using information you are collecting, I would actually encourage you to stop collecting that information, just because you have a limited amount of resources as a nonprofit and you want to use the opportunities you have to ask for feedback for information that will actually be useful. Let's see. So I'll pause there to see if you all have any questions so far.
I haven't seen any post in the Q&A. Don't forget, if you have questions, please post them up in that Q&A.
Yeah, if you have any questions about what I'm talking about or maybe something that's not as related, feel free to post it in the comments or in the chat. I have several moments where I pause throughout the webinar to answer questions. So I encourage you to put your questions in the chat. Right. So the next thing, after you take stock of the work you do, I really encourage everybody to create some sort of theory of change. Now, a theory of change is just some documentation. It could be a narrative, a drawing, a form that clarifies how the things you do are connected to the changes you want to see. What it really is a hypothesis of how you think your activities lead to your outcomes. And like I said, a theory of change can take many forms. It could be a narrative, a picture, or what I'm going to describe today is a pathway model. Another common theory of change are logic models. I'm going to describe how to do a full-blown theory of change first, but just to provide a little bit of a tease, for those of you who might not have a lot of time, I recommend a mini theory of change, and this is where it's a simpler process, and I'll go through that afterwards, but I just wanted to give you a little tease there. So when you're going to start developing a theory of change, the first thing you want to do is pick a focus. So are you going to focus on a program, an initiative, an activity? What are you going to do this theory of change for? And then you can list your activities. What specific things do your participants participate in? What do staff do? List out each activity that makes up that program or initiative. And then you want to brainstorm outcomes. So I'll pause here to talk about something that's often confused, and it's the difference between outputs and outcomes. Outputs are quantifications of your activities. So you could think of them as a number associated with the thing you do. So for example, we have one resource fair a year. We have over 100 participants in the resource fair. We hope to have 500 active referrals after the resource fair. So it's a quantification of the things you do. Outcomes, on the other hand, are the changes you hope to see. So we hope to see an increase in the number of people who apply to early childhood education programs, whether it's preschool, TK, or kindergarten. So we are doing this fair because we hope more people enroll their children in early childhood education. That's the change we want to see. Outputs and outcomes are both important. Outputs help you understand your processes and whether or not you're hitting your marks, versus outcomes help you understand whether or not you are having an impact. So both are important. A lot of times it can be easier to collect outputs, but I would ask you to stretch yourself and also collect outcome data. And sometimes when we're thinking about outcomes, it's easier for us to have categories in mind. And some common categories for outcomes are knowledge, attitude, and behavioral change. So a knowledge change might be an increased awareness in the requirements that one needs to complete to enroll their child in an early childhood education program. An attitude change might be parents having an increased belief that participating in preschool, transitional kindergarten, or kindergarten is important for their child. And a behavioral change might be something along the lines of people actually enrolling their child in an early childhood education program. And if that doesn't fit your work, I really love the 5 levers or 5 conditions of systems change. There's also, you can use this as a categorizational system. So is there a policy change you want? Maybe there's rules or regulations you want to change in your community, and that's the change you want to work towards. Maybe there are organizational habits you want to change, how budgets are allocated that you want to change. Maybe you want to increase relationships in your community around a particular topic. Maybe you want to change power dynamics, or you want to change mental models, that is, our beliefs. So once you have brainstormed outcomes, it's time for you to draw connections between your activities and your outcomes. And the way you do this is I recommend writing down your outcomes on note cards and having them all out in front of you. And then considering right after our activity, what do we hope people will walk away with? So when somebody walks away from your program, what change do you expect to see? And when those changes happen, what do you expect to happen afterwards? And if that change takes place, what do you expect to happen afterwards, and so on and so forth? So that's how you sort of develop a pathway model, which is a type of theory of change. So this clarifies how you think, or your hypothesis of how the activity you're doing is interconnected with the changes you want to see. And as you see here, these are roughly organized into short-term, intermediate term, and long-term outcomes. So once you've drawn your theory of change, drawn those connections, then you can consider any assumptions you might be making. And assumptions are potential blind spots. So some assumptions are safe to make. For example, when I got up this morning, I assumed that the internet would be running. I didn't call my internet company to make sure that the internet would be working today. That was an assumption I made, and because of my prior experience, I felt like it was a pretty safe assumption to make. However, there are other assumptions that, are potential blind spots that would be helpful if you collected data around. For example, like when we collected data around what programs community members would actually be interested in, so a full day program versus a half day program. That was an assumption we had, and if we hadn't collected data on that, we would be advocating for a sort of program that our community wasn't necessarily that interested in. So it's important to consider the assumptions you're making and whether or not you need to collect data to make sure that your assumptions are right. So you review your theory of change and consider, where are we making assumptions? Are there potential changes we need to make because of that? Next, you should consider your stakeholders' perspectives. Now, when I say stakeholders, I'm referring to anyone who has a stake in your program. This can be your participants, various staff members. So internally, some stakeholder groups can be your data collectors. Another stakeholder group might be your executive team, or your marketing team, or your social media team. You can have a variety of internal stakeholders. You can also have a variety of external stakeholders. So you might have community members that are interested in your work, advocacy groups. You might have potential funders or actual funders. You can have people who regularly donate to your work. You might have potential volunteers. All of these groups of people are potential stakeholders. And because you're a nonprofit, a lot of times might heavily depend on the relationships you have with these stakeholders, and there can be a big number of a variety of stakeholders. It's good to do a stakeholder analysis. I'm going to share the 3 different types of stakeholder analysis you can do to really consider your stakeholders' perspective. And the one I have on screen now is called a power/interest analysis. This is where you organize your stakeholders after you have brainstormed them based on how much power they have to influence your work and how much interest they have in hearing from you. So when I talk about power, I'm really talking about power to influence the decisions your organization makes about your programming, your initiatives, or the work you do. That might be different than how we traditionally think of power in our society. And when I'm talking about interest, I'm talking about how often do these stakeholder groups really want to hear from you. For example, you might have some funders that you have a lot of power over your work, but they might not want to hear the ins and outs of the daily decisions you're making about your work. Versus you might have participants that might not have as much power, or maybe they do have power in your case, more than funders, but they're probably more interested in hearing updates from you on a regular basis. The reason why you want to consider the power and the interest they have is because you want to be strategic about how you engage people. So you want to include key players, for example, and a lot of the thinking about what outcomes are important, what sort of data you want to be collecting. You want to engage them because they're interested, so they're an extra set of hands potentially. And you want to engage them because people are more likely to buy into something that they help create. So the more you engage them and you include them in your decision-making process, the more likely they are to buy into your work and support your work. Versus people who might have a lot of power to influence your decisions, but might not be as interested. You want to engage these people a little bit more strategically and consider when it's appropriate for you to reach out to them and ask for their help or ask for their strategic advice. Another thing you can do is ask yourself several questions about each stakeholder group. For example, how are they connected to your program or initiative? Why are they interested? What outcomes are important to them? So that is, what changes are important to them? How do you plan to communicate with them? How they should be involved in any data or evaluation activities? And if this is a stakeholder group, let's say a group of participants or a group of funders, do you have a representative from that group? And finally, the last type of stakeholder analysis I'll recommend is a closeness analysis. This is where you organize your stakeholders based on how knowledgeable or close they are to your program. So the more information they have about the ins and outs of the work you do, the closer they will be to the center of this diagram, versus those who might not be as knowledgeable about the work you do would be on the outskirts. So you might organize stakeholders like this. For example, your participants or your beneficiaries, because they're participating in your work, might go in the middle, versus the funders or advocates might go in the outskirts. The reason why this is important is because when you are communicating with your stakeholders, you want to have an awareness of how knowledgeable they are about your work and how much context you need to provide every single time you communicate with them so that they can give you feedback that's appropriate. Okay, so once you've done that, it's time for you to revise your theory of change. And this is where I want to mention that a theory of change is a very iterative process. It potentially might never be done. You just want to get it to a point where it's useful. So consider whether or not you're making any assumptions and if you need to make changes to it. If based on your stakeholder analysis, you need to make changes to your theory of change. For example, let's say when you do your stakeholder analysis, you realize like, hey, this particular outcome is very important to our stakeholders, but it's not in our diagram. So where does it fit? And again, it's an iterative process. A theory of change is basically how you think change happens. So it's always a working document. Don't feel pressure to get it perfect. And it's something you can always change along the way. Now, once you have a theory of change, it's not enough to have created it, even though it can be useful in terms of onboarding people or describing your program to others. You also want to use it. And the way you use it is by figuring out which outcomes you're going to collect data on. So when we do the resource fair, we're really doing this resource fair because we want children to be better prepared for school. However, it's not very reasonable for us to collect data on that. Instead, it's better for us to collect data on short-term outcomes, because these are the sorts of changes we can expect to see fairly soon. These are the sorts of changes that we will actually be able to measure. And the reason we're doing this theory of change is because we want to articulate how these short-term changes lead to intermediate-term changes and potentially collect data on intermediate-term changes. And we want to be able to articulate how all of this we think will lead to these big, lofty goals we have. Okay, so collect data on short-term outcomes. I always encourage you to start there. And the goal of the theory of change isn't to create a very intricate document and spend hours on creating it. Instead, you want to make sure you're creating this theory of change so that it's useful in terms of understanding which outcomes you need to collect data on. And that's why I encourage starting out with a mini theory of change. And if we were meeting in person, this is the sort of thing I might encourage us to do together in a workshop. The way you do this is you list your activities. So what are you doing? What are your participants participating in? What are your key outcomes? So for every activity, what do you hope will happen afterwards? What is the change you hope to see in your participant? And again, here, I would encourage you to focus in on short-term outcomes. And then consider what you're doing in terms of data collection related to those outcomes. Are you already collecting data on those outcomes? Maybe you're not. And consider opportunities to collect data or use data. For example, some of you might be participating in Long Beach Gives. If you are doing so, this is an opportunity for you to start sharing your data so that you can use it to advocate for your work. If you're not, let's say you review your data, you go through this process and you realize, hey, we're not actually collecting data on these key outcomes. That isn't to say that all is lost. There's still something you can do to help you understand your outcomes. So let's say you do this and you realize you're not collecting data. There are people out there that are probably already collecting information on the topics you're interested in. For example, for Bright Beginnings, we're interested in kindergarten readiness and school readiness. We have a partner, First Five Monterey County, that regularly, almost on every other year basis, collects data from people entering kindergarten, so children entering kindergarten, to explore how ready they are for kindergarten. And we're using this data to help us understand our outcomes and the work we're doing. So even though we're not collecting this data ourselves, that doesn't mean that we might not have access to this data already. So I would encourage you to reach out to partners or other organizations that are doing similar work to see if they're willing to share data with you. The benefit of this is that you don't need to collect that data yourself, which means you can use your resources to do other things like collecting data that other people are not already collecting. If you don't have partners, you could do a literature review. This is one of the resources I encourage you to check out is Google Scholar. So go on there and just explore what other people have collected data on related to your topics. What does the literature say about your topic? And there's also other secondary sources that you can explore. For example, some organizations provide data online, like for example, the census. They have a number of, you could collect, they collect a lot of information already that you don't necessarily need to collect yourself. And there are other organizations similar to the census that collect a lot of information on a variety of topics. So I encourage you to check these out. And these will be in the set of handouts that I provide to you for you to check out. Some of these sources are basically like data visualization applications on websites that are easy for you to look through. Other ones are a little bit more complicated and require you to download an Excel file and analyze the data yourself. So it really depends on each resource, but I definitely encourage you to check these out to see whether or not there's data already out there that you can use to advocate for your work. So just because you're not collecting data on an outcome or on a specific topic doesn't mean that you don't have potential access to that information. So again, the reason why you're doing a theory of change in any case is to identify which outcomes you should be collecting data around or using data around so that you can actually start collecting that information or explore other ways to get that information for yourself, to consider to what extent you're achieving the changes you want to see. Okay, so I'll pause there to see to what extent have you all either developed a theory of change or to what extent you're using a theory of change. And I think this is a poll. Christina, is it a poll? Oh, there it goes.
Sorry about that. Technical difficulties on my end. All right, so everybody should see a poll up on your screen. Take a look at it now, please, and let us know your thoughts. And we'll leave it up for about another 30 seconds or so, but take a look if you can. There we go. Now we're seeing some answers rolling in. Okay, give it about another 5 more seconds and we'll end that out and share the results. There you go.
Okay, so it seems like a lot of you have identified key outcomes. You made the connection between your activities and outcomes. And most of you have collected data related to outcomes. So that's great. I'm happy to hear that. Again, the reason why you're doing a theory of change is to really identify what key outcomes you should be collecting data on. Having these data on outcomes are what's really going to let you know whether or not your work is actually effective. If your work is not effective, it's something you want to know so that you can decide what else you might be doing with the resources you have so that you can ultimately achieve your mission. So if you don't have a lot of time, I encourage you to do a mini theory of change. And if you have time, I definitely encourage you to do a full-blown theory of change. And again, you don't have to do every single step. Just do the steps that you think will be useful to your organization. Okay, so I'll pause there to see if there are any questions.
Still seems like we have a quiet group or a less inquisitive group, and that's okay. Maybe you're just answering all of the questions ahead of time, which is great.
Okay, so I definitely encourage you to give me any questions. I'm more than happy to answer them along the way. Okay, so let's see. The next thing we have is decision making. So one term that I've heard a lot recently is becoming a data-informed organization or a data-driven organization. And what this really means, at least to me, is an organization that regularly uses data to make decisions. So in order for us to really do this, we need to reflect on our decision-making process and make sure that we can streamline it as much as possible. And that's why I'm going to share this activity with you. Again, I created a set of slides for you to follow along if you want to do this on your own afterwards. The first thing you should do in terms of reflecting on your decision-making processes is to consider which decisions you have coming up. So identify the decisions that are coming up and when you need to start collecting data based on the decisions that are coming up. So when are the decisions going to have to be finalized, and then backtrack from there. So when the decision needs to be finalized, based on that date, when do you have to start your decision-making process? Based on that, when do you have to start collecting data so that it is available for that decision-making process? You should also identify who your decision makers are going to be and who will be influencing those decisions or influencing the decision makers. So although not all your stakeholders are going to be making the decision, maybe they can provide context that the decision makers can use to make better decisions. So if you do a power/interest analysis, your decision makers are probably going to be at the very top of this diagram. They're the people who have the power to influence your decisions, so they'll probably be the ones making decisions as well. And when you're thinking about who is going to influence those decision makers or who can provide context for the data so that your decision makers can use the data to make decisions, it's probably going to be the people at the center of your closeness analysis. So these are the people who are going to be able to say, we collected these data, but here's a couple caveats you should consider when you're looking at these findings. You should also consider what data collection opportunities you have. And what I recommend doing here is something from the design thinking world, and it's called a journey map. It's where you consider or make a diagram showing all your touch points with your participants. So from start to finish, how are people interacting with your program or your work? Where are you talking to them? Where are they coming in and interacting with your organization or your program? So draw these out, and based on this, you'll probably notice some naturally occurring touch points where you might be able to ask your participants for feedback or data. So you might be already interacting with them. Those are great opportunities for you to potentially hand out a survey or just ask them a few questions so that it doesn't add to their interactions with you. It's something that naturally occurs. Alternatively, when you do this, you might find some potential places where it makes sense for you to insert a data collection activity in between touch points. So you can either find something that naturally occurs, or you might be able to find something that you can add in easily. And this is a picture of what the handout looks like. So once you have identified your potential data collection opportunities, you need to consider what sort of data or what stakeholders need to make your decisions or make the decisions that are necessary. I'll talk a little bit more about the distinctions of data here. So there are quantitative data. That is a type of data that involves numbers. So think of averages or the number of people experiencing a situation. There's also qualitative data. So quantitative data helps you understand what is going on, whereas qualitative data helps you understand why things are happening the way they are. It's often the sort of data that takes a little bit more time to review because it's very text heavy, or you're collecting it through conversations. So it's the sort of thing that will help you understand why things are happening the way they are. So as you might imagine, both data types are very beneficial. One helps you understand what is happening. The other one helps you understand why it's happening. A lot of times you want to include a mix of both quantitative and qualitative data. And I'll pause here to say that sometimes there are stakeholders that prefer quantitative data over qualitative data. And that's a consideration you have to have in the back of your mind when you're considering what sort of information you're going to gather and how you're going to present it to stakeholders. So aside from that, the general types of data, there are different, very broad data collection methods. So we have interviews. This is where you have a one-on-one conversation with somebody about a particular topic. You also have focus groups. This is where you have a group discussion about a particular topic. You also have surveys. You might imagine questionnaires or forms that people fill out. Another sort of data collection method is a document analysis. This is where you review documents that already exist to explore a topic. And finally, you have observations. This is where a data collector might go out and observe something happening in real time. They might have a rubric they use to make sure they're observing things consistently. So these are very broad methods, and every time I look at a new data collection method, I always find that it can fall into one of these very broad categories. So you might be thinking, that's great, but how do I choose which method I should use? And what you should do is consider what your stakeholders are going to find credible. So what sort of information are they more likely to believe and therefore more likely to use when they're making decisions? What sort of data collection method is actually feasible given your participants, your interactions with them, and the topic you're exploring? And what sort of data collection method is going to actually help you find the truth? So what's going to get you closer to what reality is? So some, for example, if you're exploring a very sensitive topic, maybe an interview is more appropriate versus a form somebody fills out, because people are less likely to share sensitive information on forms. So consider which method is the most appropriate given your topic, what's going to help you identify information in the most truthful manner, or gather information in the most truthful manner. And as I was preparing for this webinar and the other webinar I have next month, I was doing some research on some of your organizations, and I looked on your websites, and I know a lot of you are already collecting data. For example, you're collecting testimonials and stories already. And you can easily turn testimonials into data, for example. What you have to do is make sure you're being systematic. So when I mean systematic, I mean that you are collecting data or collecting information in a consistent manner. That is, you're asking everyone the same questions and you're asking everyone. So you're doing this consistently. You're also trying to incorporate various perspectives or various angles. That is, you're not just asking the people who are going to give you the gold star, you're also asking people who might be a little bit critical. Or you're not just asking participants to share information, maybe you ask their parents to share information with you. And you're also taking care to avoid biases. So what I mean by this is you're really reflecting on what your internal biases might be, and you're making sure that when you're asking questions, you ask them in a neutral way. So you're not leading your participant to give you the answer you want to hear. So you're keeping things neutral so that they have the opportunity to be honest with you. Okay. A lot of times what I find some organizations struggle with is they feel like they don't have the capacity to do some very technical data collection, and therefore they feel like they can't do data collection. One of the most popular evaluators or people in my field is Michael Quinn Patton. And I really love this quote, and it says that rigor resides in rigorous thinking, not methods. So as long as you are thoughtful about the data you are collecting and you are being systematic in the way you are collecting that data, so you're consistent, you're considering different perspectives, and you're trying your hardest to avoid biases, your data is rigorous. There are no data sets out there that are perfect. And what you want to make sure is that you have the information you need when you are making decisions, as opposed to spending a lot of time creating a very complex data collection process that will ultimately result in you not using the data. So make sure you ask or create a data collection process that is useful to you. For example, some low-tech ways I collect data often is when I do workshops in person. At the end, I ask people to give me a few Post-its or go to the back of the room and do a plus delta. And I basically ask people, is there anything you really liked? So plus, or you would have liked to see more of? Plus, is there anything you would like to change? So that delta, that triangle, is a symbol for change. And then I add whether or not they have any outstanding questions. So this is a very quick way for me to get feedback about the sessions. I do potentially get more ideas on how I can improve it. So it's a great way for me to quickly get information. Obviously, there are things that might be more technical, that might be more time consuming. For example, I could get this information by calling people and asking them whether or not they have time to maybe have a 20-minute discussion with me about the workshop. But that can be very time consuming and ultimately maybe not even give me all the quick information I need to adjust my presentations in real time so that I can improve quickly. Another thing I do that's very low tech is I do dot voting a lot of times. So when I'm having a conversation with a group of stakeholders and we kind of want to see or collect data on what sort of decisions or what sort of ideas are more popular, I have them just put dots next to the idea they like the most. So all this to say that it's better for you to have some data to guide your decision making versus none. You don't have to create some very technical process. As long as you are being systematic in your data collection, it is data and it can be very useful when you're making those decisions. So you might be asking or might not be aware or uncertain about what sort of information you might want to gather. Generally speaking, you want to ask people what's working well, whom is it working well for, and why. And on the flip side, you also want to know what's not going so well, who is it not going so well for, and why. Other things you might ask yourself or ask participants to give you information on is what are your community strengths and what are your community needs? And again, you don't have to do this in a very technical way, particularly given that, you know, we have all been through a lot of change in our community. We have COVID going on, COVID-19, and there's, you know, protests and civil unrest. This could be a great opportunity for you to reach out to your community and say, you know, there are a lot of things that have changed recently. Is there anything you think are particular needs now? Are there any things you see as strengths that our community has that we can build upon? So those are just a couple ideas of what sort of data you might be asking your participants to provide to you. So now, along with this, you might be also wondering, how do you create data collection tools? Once you decide what you want to explore, what do you do to actually create the tools you need? So a data collection tool development process is iterative, and it can change based on when your needs change. What I encourage you to do is to clarify the sort of information you want to know. So what topics are you interested in exploring? Explore how other people have collected data on that topic. So you might ask partners how they have explored data on that topic or collected data on that topic. Or you might, again, do a literature review to see how other people have collected the sort of information you want to collect. If you are interested in collecting something, chances are that other people have collected similar data, and you can build off of their experiences to create your own tools. And once you have a draft tool, what I encourage you to do is to share it with a couple participants and do a test run to make sure that you're getting the sort of information you're looking for. And remember, it's an iterative process. Just like the example I shared earlier when we edited our resource fair survey, we edited this tool that we had been using for years to one that is more useful to us now. Okay, so once you have identified what data you're going to collect, it's time for you to consider how your data will get to your decision makers. So how is that information going to flow from your within your organization? So how are you going to get your participants to give the data to your data collectors, and who are your data collectors, and how are you going to get that information to the stakeholders who are going to be making the decisions? And as you're doing this, you should consider how you are going to incorporate sense-making opportunities. So a sense-making opportunity is something like what I call a data party. It's where you get stakeholders together to look at the data, consider what the data is telling them, why this data are important, and then consider what you're going to do next. So this sort of framework is called the what, so what, now what framework. And it's something I use when I do a sense-making opportunity or a data party. So for example, I might get stakeholders together and I have a sheet like this where I provide a quick summary of the data we collected, and I have some discussion questions for them to reflect on and consider. So I will have them think about what surprised them about these data. Is there anything you were expecting? How might we improve for next year? What does this data tell us about our general initiative? And in the handout I provide to you, I have other questions you might ask as well. So it really depends on what you are going to use your data for when you are determining what sort of questions you're going to ask. But overall, you should give your stakeholders the chance to look at the data and consider its implications for your work when they're making decisions. And the purpose of all this is to ensure that you are incorporating data into your decision-making processes. Okay, so I have another question for you all. How often do you incorporate this data into your decision-making processes?
Okay, if you take a look at your screen, you should see the question up on your screen. Please help us out. Give us an answer and hit submit. And just so everybody knows, the webinar will end in about 20 minutes. And then we will process the video and post it up and send it to everybody, as well as the slides. I'm giving about another 5 seconds on that. And here we go.
Okay, so it seems like a few decisions involve a data discussion. So I definitely encourage you all to start incorporating those sense-making sessions into your work. They don't have to be long. It can just be you joining a meeting that already exists, coming with a sheet like this that clearly describes your data very quickly, and asking them what they think. Again, so far we've talked about taking stock of your work, identifying key outcomes, and then clarifying your decision-making processes. And I'll pause there to see if there are any questions before I jump into the next quick section.
We actually do have quite a few in the Q&A box, but if you would like to read them and just kind of see which ones are applicable right now. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just bear with us.
So now that we're working remotely, platforms. Okay, so I'm going to talk about some remote data collection opportunities in a bit. So I'll leave that one there. Let's see. Many development directors are outputs. Yeah, so definitely it's great to start incorporating outcomes into your data collection processes. So this one's an interesting question. Funders sometimes define the outcomes they are looking for quite specifically. How does an organization keep that from creating mission creep? So I think this is a very tough question to answer. Generally speaking, I would say each organization has to have a very clear mission, and based on their mission, develop a theory of change that they would like to pursue. So let's say you don't already have activities, there are probably changes each organization is interested in pursuing, and those need to be clear to each organization so that when funders so that you can pursue funders that have similar outcomes as you, and when funders are pushing you to change your outcomes, you can clearly articulate why you chose the outcomes you chose and how those are going to ultimately achieve the mission that you are working towards. So you have to have a very, very clear idea of what your specific organization wants to work towards, what outcomes your organization is interested, so that when you come across people who push back and ask you to change those, you can clearly articulate why you're not willing to change those, and or how your outcomes might be similar in some way to their outcomes. So that's why I always encourage people to just have a theory of change, so that you're very clear about what you're working towards and why you're working towards that and how you think change happens. So when that somebody pushes back, you have your talking points ready, and you know what your mission is and what you are working towards and why the data you are collecting is important to your organization, and you know what funders to go after. So I hope that was helpful. How to create valid measures for your organization and those they serve that correspond to, I guess, funder desire outcomes. So what I, again, would say, you have to be very clear about what you want to go after. So what outcomes do you really want to achieve? It can also be beneficial if funders are interested, to have a discussion with them about the outcomes you're working towards, so that they're clear what your mission is, why you're doing the work the way you're doing it, and how you think change happens, and why you're collecting the data you want to collect. In terms of finding valid measures, I would say look through the literature to see how other people have collected data about the topic you're interested in collecting data. Again, this probably differs from organization to organization and from topic to topic also. But I would reach out to experts related to your topic. So for example, recently I developed a tool designed to and I'll talk a little bit about it in a few moments, but the tool was designed to understand to what extent stakeholders are learning about, not stakeholders, sorry, to what extent participants are learning about early childhood development concepts. So I looked at the literature to see how other people measured that outcome. And then I compiled a set of tools that I thought would be useful. And I shared it with experts that are connected to the work we're doing. And I got their thoughts about what they thought would be the most useful sorts of questions, what they thought was feasible versus not feasible, and the way we should go about it. And then we went to our funder and we shared with them, we're collecting data in this way because these are the sorts of outcomes we could measure now. And this is the sort of tool experts, thought would be the most feasible and the most appropriate for us to use right now. So I think you have to have a clear understanding of the work you want to do first and the reasons behind why you want to do the work you want to do in the way you want to do it. So when a funder comes along, you can clearly articulate why it is you're doing things the way you're doing it. And you're more likely to be able to push back effectively. Okay. So I hope that was helpful, and definitely reach out to me if you want more descriptions on how I do that. Okay. And feel free to write more questions. I'll pause in a few minutes again before the session ends to ask, to answer questions. So the last section we're going to go through is the improvement process. So one common improvement process or framework that's used broadly out there is plan, do, check, act. And the check part is specifically related to data collection, and it's one of the reasons why I like this framework. And again, I have handouts for you to explore. As I go through this activity, I'm going to share an example from Bright Beginnings. Again, this example is specifically around a program where we have play groups. So caregivers come with their children, and the children have an opportunity to play with each other. The caregiver gets to learn about an activity they could easily implement at home, and our playgroup facilitator along the way is teaching parents about early childhood education concepts. So they're teaching caregivers and parents about how children develop so that they have more knowledge about early childhood development and can therefore hopefully facilitate that process better. The curriculum in this particular program, the Playgroups program, is dynamic. And what I mean by that is that the curriculum is changed and updated based on what people report learning. So whenever we see a gap in what people are learning, our facilitator then adjusts the upcoming curriculum so she can address those gaps. And that's why it was important for us to figure out how we want to continuously collect data from people in a non-invasive manner that can help us figure out what sort of upcoming lessons we want to learn, we want to plan. So when you're doing an improvement process, you should identify which stakeholders can easily gather data on potential improvements. And if we look at our closest analysis, oftentimes it's the people closest to the center. So these are the people who are closest to participants, and how the program is implemented, so they know potential pitfalls. They have access to participants to get information easily. And again, participants are the ones who are providing the feedback. So once you identify who is going to be involved in your improvement process, you should identify what sort of data you might gather. So as I said, the play groups, our goal here is to improve caregiver caregiver knowledge about early childhood development concepts, so motor skills, literacy skills, and social emotional skills, and how they might facilitate those skills in the children they care for, as well as understanding the need or importance of learning through play with their child and developing a safe home environment. So those are all the things we wanted to gather data on. So once we decided what we wanted to gather data on, it was time for us to develop data collection tools. So initially, because we wanted to collect data quickly and with as little effort from participants, we thought we should do a survey. And that's what we were doing initially. And then what we found is that the participants or the people who were attending these playgroups were primarily Spanish speaking. And some of them had very limited reading and writing skills. So the survey was not useful, and it even made it so that the playgroup facilitator had to probably spend more time than we wanted her to spend collecting data at the end of each session. So instead, we decided to change our data collection method to a quick discussion, or what some people might call a focus group, about what people were learning. And now that COVID-19 has happened and we all have to social distance, I wanted to call out some data collection methods that are conducive to us not being together. For example, one is journaling. You could ask participants to journal about their experiences and then collect those journals after the fact and look for major themes and to understand what people are experiencing in terms of your program. This will require you to develop some clear prompts. Another thing you can do is message people. So now that we can no longer have short, small discussions with our play groups, what we're planning to do is to text people questions about what their needs are, text people about the services we are providing while we're being remote and how they're experiencing that. So this is another way for you to collect data that doesn't require you to be in person. Another thing you can do is to have people join an online group and then post questions there and have them respond to you through the online group. A very low-tech way that has been around for, years is just a simple phone call. I have often done interviews through phone calls. It's a simple way for you to collect data. Just like you would in person, you can interview people through the phone. Another way to do a focus group is through a video conference. Again, this will require you to have people who are tech savvy enough to join a video conference like Zoom. There are also virtual boards. I think an example of this might be Mural, where you can have, where it's almost like a document people can write on together. You can send people the link to your document that has questions on it and have people leave Post-its responding to those questions. Another example of virtual data collection you can do is photo voice. Photo voice is a method where you have people respond to a prompt by taking pictures of their daily experiences and then maybe writing a short summary about how this picture is a response to the prompt. There are a lot of tools out there and resources out there to do photo voice. And then again, online surveys. This is a very common way for us to collect data. It's something that we were doing before we had to be virtual with each other and social distance. There are a number of free data survey collection tools out there. For example, you have Google Forms, and there are free versions of even paid services like Google, not Google, SurveyMonkey, SurveyGizmo, Typeform. There's a number of resources out there for you to use online surveys. in terms of using online surveys, you just have to make sure that you're following best practices when you're creating your survey tool. And this goes for any data collection method. You should follow best practices. And in the handouts I provided you, I have a list of questions you can ask yourself to ensure that you are following best practices. Let me do a time check. Okay, so you just have to make sure that you are collecting data in a systematic way. Whatever tool you're using, you have to make sure you're being consistent. You are considering various perspectives or angles and avoiding biases. So this means that you don't have to be very technically savvy or have a tool that has, been vetted thoroughly. You just have to make sure you're consistent, incorporate various perspectives, and avoid biases. And once you do this, you should consider how you're going to get your information throughout the process, throughout your organization. For example, in our playgroups example, we have the playgroup session, or we did it previously. We hosted a playgroup session. Then we had the facilitator complete a discussion guide. Afterwards, the facilitator coded responses, and then she planned future sessions based on those responses. This is an example of data we got back from some of those discussions. So here we can quickly see that literacy was a topic that was rated the least. So when our facilitator plans future sessions, she's going to think about how she could incorporate literacy skills more into those sessions so that participants walk away with that information. Okay. So you're reflecting on your improvement process so that you could find places to streamline it and incorporate data throughout the process. So I'll skip this question just to be mindful of time. And just a very quick overview of everything we discussed so far. I shared with you some activity you can do to take stock of your work, your context, and the data you're collecting. I shared a couple ways to identify key outcomes, either doing a mini theory of change or a full-blown theory of change. I described how you can clarify your decision-making. I also described how you can reflect on your improvement processes. So that's everything we've talked about so far. So I'll pause there to see if there's any questions, any initial feedback.
I know that we're coming up on time. So while she peruses the questions, I just want to thank everybody who has been able to stay with us. I know some people had to leave early to jump to another meeting, but we truly appreciate you staying with us. And if there are any further questions that you wanted to answer, Michelle, or wanted to take a look at, we can do that. I know we'll wrap up after that.
I don't think there are any I hope I answered the ones in there.
I think you did. Yeah, that's
okay.
I wanted to see additional ones. Perfect. Well, if anybody has any last minute questions, or if you have any last minute kind of tips and tricks, and we'll jump.
Yeah. So all I want to say is your data should be useful in terms that it should help you make improvements, make decisions, help you understand to what extent your work is successful or that is achieving your outcomes, and importantly, help you make the case for your work. So help you show that there's a need for the things your services, and that you are the person to do those services for them. In order for our data to be meaningful, we have to be thoughtful about what we collect and why we're collecting it, because we want to make sure that our data are helping us achieve our ultimate mission and impact. So that's it for me. I know you ran out of time, and I thank everybody for joining. Feel free to email me or reach out to me if you have any questions or need any clarifications. And I know I have a set of handouts for you all to look through and do these activities on your own. So if you have any questions on that, feel free to reach out as well.
And I will put in a plug for your videos because I have been watching them and thoroughly enjoying them. So if you haven't checked out Michelle's videos on her channel, they are fantastic. They are just kind of like this, like very walking you through the process and very easy to follow. So thank you so much, Michelle, for sharing your wealth of information and your guidance with us today. Thank you to everybody who joined us. We're going to wrap this up right here. We will send out the slides as well as the video for this to you, and also posting it up on TNP's website. Thanks again to our sponsors. And Michelle, again, this was fantastic. Thank you. And if you have questions or requests, or if you're really looking for something to be presented in a webinar format or in a workshop and you haven't seen it offered by TNP yet, then please let us know. Email us at info@tnpsocal.org. Let us know what you need. We're looking to provide that information to you. So thanks again, everybody, and have a great rest of the day. Enjoy.
Thanks, everybody.